All righty now. Okay, it's 15 October, more distant that. I'm continuing on with Paul Feyerabend's work against method. We're not reading the whole thing. Come across a outline of an anarchistic theory of knowledge. I want to compare that with another text by a sociologist that introduces some postulates for historical materialism. And I think it's hopefully you'll see the similarities and differences. Paul Feyerabend, formerly of Austria and the United States. His major book, I think, is Against Method. There's some other really good books, but this is the most accessible, I suppose. Science is an essentially anarchistic enterprise. Theoretical anarchism is more humanitarian and more likely to encourage progress than its law and order alternatives. This is shown both by an examination of historical episodes and by an abstract analysis of the relation between idea and action. The only principle that does not inhibit progress is anything goes. For example, we may use hypotheses that contradict well-confirmed theories and/or well-established experimental results. We may advance science by proceeding counter-inductively. The consistency condition, which demands that new hypotheses agree with accepted theories, is unreasonable because it preserves the older theory and not the better theory. Hypotheses contradicting well-confirmed theories give us evidence that cannot be obtained in any other way. Proliferation of theories is beneficial for science, while uniformity impairs its critical power. Uniformity also endangers the free development of the individual. There is no idea, however ancient and absurd, that is not capable of improving our knowledge. The whole history of thought is absorbed into science and is used for improving every single theory. Nor is political interference rejected. It may be needed to overcome the chauvinism of science that resists alternatives to the status quo. No theory ever agrees with all the facts in its domain, yet it is not always the theory that is to blame. Facts are constituted by older ideologies, and a clash between facts and theories may actually be proof of progress. It is also a first step in our attempts to find the principles implicit in familiar observational notions. As an example of such an attempt, I examined the tower argument, which the Aristotelians used to refute the motion of the earth. The argument involves natural interpretations, that is, ideas so closely connected with observations that it needs a special effort to realize their existence and to determine their content. Galileo identifies the natural interpretations which are inconsistent with Copernicus and replaces them by others. The new natural interpretations constitute a new and highly abstract observation language. They are introduced and concealed so that one fails to notice the change that has taken place, a method of anamnesis. They contain the idea of the relativity of all motion and the law of circular inertia. Initial difficulties caused by the change are diffused by ad hoc hypotheses, which thus turn out occasionally to have a positive function. They give new theories a breathing space, and they indicate the direction of future research. In addition to natural interpretations, Galileo also changes sensations that seem to endanger Copernicus. He admits that there are such sensations. He praises Copernicus for having disregarded them. He claims to have removed them with the help of the telescope. However, he offers no theoretical reasons why the telescope should be expected to give a true picture of the sky. Nor does the initial experience with the telescope provide such reasons. The first telescopic observations of the sky are indistinct, indeterminate, contradictory, and in conflict with what everyone can see with his unaided eyes. And the only theory that could have helped to separate telescopic illusions from veridical phenomena was refuted by simple tests. On the other hand, there are some telescopic phenomena which are plainly Copernican. Galileo introduces these phenomena as independent evidence for Copernicus, while the situation is rather that one refuted view. Copernicanism has a certain similarity with phenomena emerging from another refuted view, the idea that telescopic phenomena are faithful images of the sky. Galileo prevails because of his style and his clever techniques of persuasion, because he writes in Italian rather than in Latin, and because he appeals to people who are temperamentally opposed to the old ideas and the standards of learning connected with them. Such irrational methods of support are needed because of the uneven development, see Marx and Lenin, of different parts of science. Copernicanism and other essential ingredients of modern science survived only because reason was frequently overruled in their past. Galileo's method works in other fields as well. For example, it could be used to eliminate the existing arguments against materialism and to put an end to the philosophical mind-body problem. The corresponding scientific problems remain untouched, however. The results obtained so far suggest abolishing the distinction between a context of discovery and a context of justification, and disregarding the related distinction between observational terms and theoretical terms. Neither distinction plays a role in scientific practice. Attempts to enforce them would have disastrous consequences. Finally, the discussion in chapters 6 through 13 shows that Popper's version, that is Karl Popper's version of John Stuart Mill's pluralism, is not in agreement with scientific practice and would destroy science as we know it. Given science, reason cannot be universal and unreason cannot be excluded. This feature of science calls for an anarchistic epistemology. The realization that science is not sacrosanct and that the debate between science and myth has ceased without having been won by either side further strengthens the case for anarchism. Even the ingenious attempt of Lakatos to construct a methodology that A, does not issue orders, and yet B, puts restrictions upon our knowledge-increasing activities, does not escape this conclusion. For Lakatos's philosophy appears liberal only because it is an anarchism in disguise. And his standards, which are abstracted from modern science, cannot be regarded as neutral arbiters in the issue between modern science and Aristotelian science, myth, magic, religion, etc. Moreover, these standards, which involve a comparison of content classes, are not always applicable. The content classes of certain theories are incomparable in the sense that none of the usual logical relations, that is, inclusion, exclusion, overlap, can be said to hold between them. This occurs when we compare myths with science. It also occurs in the most advanced, most general, and therefore most mythological parts of science itself. Thus, science is much closer to myth than a scientific philosophy is prepared to admit. It is one of the many forms of thought that have been developed by man, and not necessarily the best. It is conspicuous, noisy, and impudent, but it is inherently superior only for those who have already decided in favor of a certain ideology, or have accepted it without having ever examined its advantages and its limits. And as the accepting and rejecting of ideology should be left to the individual, it follows that the separation of state and church must be supplemented by the separation of state and science, that most recent, most aggressive, and most dogmatic religious institution. Such a separation may be our only chance to achieve a humanity we are capable of, but have never fully realized. So whether you got anything out of that is, however you want to describe it, it does, in fact, inform a certain, as it were, anarchistic view, which is not necessarily, as I hope you can see, chaotic. Now, the second thing I picked is from a fellow who taught sociology at Berkeley and writes on Marxism as a scientific method. And, it's constructed in an interesting way. It is mainly addressed to sociologists, but which may or may not be a good thing. But it does use the same kinds of criteria, questions that we would ask in terms of constructing a method, scientific or otherwise. Marxism is the most interesting case of the moral force of the immorality, which probably sums it up in many words, in so many words. Thomas S. Kuhn, agreed with Karl Popper that Marxism is not a science, not because it could not be falsified, that's the important part, but because its practitioners were not primarily concerned with normalizing its anomalies. So that says something about the empirical process. And so I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs, and it's contextualized in a broader way about certain features of a scientific method. Contemporary philosophy of science has moved from normative conceptions that search for the method of science to historically rooted characterizations that seek to establish the logical conditions for the growth of knowledge. The early inductive models of science associated with Hume, Mill, and the school of logical positivism, that is, Nagel and Hempel, insisted that scientific laws be derived from empirical examinations of the facts. From this point of view, Marxism, rather than responding to the facts, is said to impose itself on the facts. It is ideology, metaphysics, religion, or moral passion, but not science. And that's an interesting question, and Kolakowski is actually a useful person to read in a much broader sense, and more specifically in relation to certain Polish ideas, as it were. Durkheim put it bluntly: the truth is that the facts and observations assembled by Marxist theoreticians anxious to document their affirmations are hardly there except to give form to the arguments. The research studies they made were undertaken to establish a doctrine that they had previously conceived, rather than the doctrine being the result of research. Popper's conclusion about Marxism were similar, but were based on a very different conception of science. In his view, science is not an induction machine which derives laws from facts. Theories necessarily precede facts because they determine which facts are relevant. Facts exist neither to generate nor to confirm, but to falsify theories. This is Popperianism. Science proceeds, therefore, not through a process of securing the best fit or explaining the greatest variance, but through the refutation of bold conjectures. In Popper's view, the best theories are the ones that are unlikely to be true, yet hold up under sustained attempts at refutation. This is the falsification issue. According to Popper, Marx's original theory of the collapse of capitalism was just such a bold conjecture, and thus scientific, but was proven false and therefore should be rejected. Yet instead of accepting the refutations, the followers of Marx reinterpreted both the theory and the evidence in order to make them agree. In this way, they rescued the theory from refutation, but they did so at the price of adopting a device which made them irrefutable. They thus gave a conventionalist twist to the theory, and by this stratagem, they destroyed much of its advertised claim to scientific status. According to Popper, Marxists pursued confirmations of their theories rather than establishing criteria for their falsification. Marxism, like psychoanalysis, could not be proven wrong, and therefore could not be a true science. Now, I'll close with reading as a Barrois article where he does a table on Marx's 7 postulates of historical materialism. If you want to go further into the issue of, why Popper gives us, on the one hand, a sense that we could have kind of open inquiry, etc., but also be affected by the closed, in his view, nature of Marxist thinking. All of that sort of stuck in history and stuck in a kind of Soviet sort of view of what Marxism and communism is. And so, the attempts in the post-war period to sort of liberate that are not unlike Karl Popper's fight with Wittgenstein using fireplace pokers, but that's a whole nother story. Marx's 7 postulates of historical materialism. For there to be history, men and women must, this is number 1, postulate of historical materialism 1. For there to be history, men and women must transform nature into the means of their survival. That is, they must produce the means of their existence. In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will, relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of the development of the productive forces. This is page 4 of the 1859 Introduction of the Critique of Political Economy. Postulate 2. The economic base or mode of production defines the limits of variation of the superstructure. Recall that there is this notion of base and superstructure, which is not universally applicable necessarily to Marxian thought. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which there rises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. Postulate 3. A mode of production develops through the interaction between the forces of production, that is, how we produce the means of existence, and the relations of production, how the product of labor is appropriated and distributed. Quote, at a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come in conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution, unquote. Postulate 4. Class struggle is the motor of transition from one mode of production to another. Quote, with the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic. In short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. The antagonisms, right? Postulate 5. A successful transition can only take place when the material conditions are present. No social order ever perishes before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed, and new, higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Postulate 6. History is progressive insofar as it follows the expansion of the forces of production. Quote, in broad outlines, Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production can be designated as progressive epochs in the economic formation of society. Note, of course, these are the historical modes of production, and the two remaining are, of course, socialism and communism. And the Asiatic, of course, is a whole different set of issues. All right, last one, postulate 7 in Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859 by Marx. Communism spells the end of social antagonisms and the beginning of the emancipation of individuals. We no longer make history behind our backs, but consciously and collectively. Quote, the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but of one arising from the social conditions of life of the individuals. At the same time, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. This social formation, these social formations bring, therefore, the prehistory of human society to a close. So that's kind of the end point of, of what a historical materialism is, right? It is a way of looking at history of time, a certain, sort of inevitability, a teleology, I suppose, and other things can derive from that, needless to say. Okay, so that's sort of what I just wanted to cover today. I know that may or may not question that will probably be solved by doing a little bit more reading, but I hope that you can sort of appreciate the differences, the points that Feyerabend is making about how science is not as absolute, but it is not purely relativistic. It is simply sort of a contending of certain sets of ideas. It sits on a, as it were, on a plane of contention, or a contestable, surface, as it were. And that's kind of how methodology evolves. And the second point I wanted to make was that in the history of and philosophy of science, there is a whole variety of criteria that have arrived in some ways to dominate our points of view, and often as not even pointed out by Feyerabend, that there are ideological dispositions that can be incredibly problematic and act religiously in often somewhat deleterious ways. And we can go back through history, Lamarck, Phlogiston, a bunch of other stuff that is interesting from a philosophical point of view, but not very useful from any other point of view in terms of politics or economics or whatever. So it does set up the interesting problem of what counts as a moral or human science. So that's kind of where that is. Let's see if there's any comments. Four-place polars, please. Um, I'm sorry, Joe. If you're still listening, yes, I will. I will shut this off. If are there any Marx should have registered Marxism as a church. Indeed, although he probably wouldn't. No one would have licensed it. Let's put it that way. I think the academy, the university, is probably the place. One of the few places where you could displace the church as a means by which you follow that argument. And in fact, it's the academy is really one of the few places left where you can still have these things go on. Noting that many Catholic institutions for many years, and probably still do, they're the ones that actually maintain the study of Marxism in a variety of places for a variety of reasons, partially because in some ways they were trying to survive within socialist countries, but also because it's a useful counter argument that, allows you, and because Catholicism itself systematizes, as it were, dogma. It's just one of many dogmas they'd love to work with, and noting, of course, the emergence of um, liberation theology as this kind of a larger kind of way in which the church can do outreach, whatever, and I think that's the way that it evolved in the Latin American context. So there is a certain tolerance of certain types of ideas, partially because it has a fair amount of consistency, but it is also not unlike the study in the Catholic faith, a systematic dogmatism. It's just another systematic dogmatism in that context. So I'm responding to Anna's point. And it is an ideological disposition, but it is one, as I think you can appreciate, that its relation to science has always been importantly argued in a contestable or in a interesting sort of way, particularly when you look at what we looked at in Bellamy Foster, addressing nature, and Engels sort of puttering around with problems of nature, and the relation to natural science, and the kind of questioning that scientists who worry about that relation between humans and nature, sort of trying to work through, particularly in the 19th century. So all of that kind of works together. And then, of course, with the emergence of communism, or really existing socialism, you see people trying to make the connections, and how at various points of the history of Marxism and science, that these things begin to come together in interesting ways. And that's why the Bellamy Foster book is useful, because it does a kind of history of ideas approach of how left-leaning scientists integrated that material. Oh, Kelly, did you have yes, your hand is raised.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I'm what you were talking about, and I'm sorry if I missed your major point, but it sounds as though you were talking about how ideas are formed within a discipline of.
Yes.
And it just reminded me, if you'll indulge me, I've got this quote from Bellamy Foster's Return to
Sure.
Nature introduction, and
Sure.
it's on that very point. And just if you'll let me read it, I'd be so happy. So here it goes.
If you have it in front of you, do you
I
have the
did it.
page number?
No, because I'm
Oh,
looking
all right. I'm just okay. Go ahead.
okay. It is due to this focus on the emergence of ecological critique and the complex and necessary contradictory searches by materialists and socialists for meaningful ecological praxis that this work is able to escape many of the methodological traps that have plagued studies in the history of ideas, namely adoption of one-sidedly internist or externalist approaches.
Mhm.
Employment of rigid ideal types, semicolon, reliance on a few isolated texts, and above all, coming to the hegemony of the present, or what E.P. Thompson called the enormous condescension of posterity.
Hmm.
As Quentin Skinner famously stated, claiming, quote, "We are all Marxists to this extent," unquote, the only justifiable reason for carrying out studies in this history of ideas is not to demonstrate the inevitability or superiority of the present in relation to the past, but rather to demonstrate how, and in quotes, our own society places unrecognized constraints on our imaginations.
Hmm.
And so that last part is what really caught me, was that these methodologies, and and I'm not quite understanding exactly how anarchism ties into this, but the constraints of these, you know, what is, you know, what is the proper science, rather than coming up with something that's really out there and then being challenged to prove or disprove. So I
Well,
don't
that's exactly. Thank
know.
you. No, thank you for that, because that's exactly the current problem. Let me do a Trump here and divert your attention. I'm not changing the topic. It does seem to me that this is the same question raised by some other folks relative to, for example, inequality. And so, even if you don't agree or believe that the Nobel Prize in economics exists, the person who was a front runner last year, Darren Agamoglu, who's at MIT, a Turk, by the way, um, is developed in his research, along with Robinson and whatever his name is, Simon Johnson, the head of the IMF, and it's all about politics in this particular case, that these three guys got it. But no, Agomagalu, um, that did all the heavy lifting. Um, the issue is that institutions, or what they tried to prove in their research, is that institutions matter in the formation of ideology, which we could have all just sort of said and not done any empirical research and gone home. But the fact is, there's more quote unquote scientific support for this idea. Uh, notwithstanding Piketty, et cetera. And I think that similarly, we have the same problem in Marxism, is to not be burdened by certain ideological restrictions on the ways in which we develop ideas. And we are always sort of confronted with the history of anarchism, which has incredibly problematic elements, verges towards, as Feyerabend identifies, the so-called law and order definition. That is, you've just got to smash everything. Um, to a theoretical position where, it's not about smashing everything. It is simply that we're all more self-governing, and yet we acknowledge our own collective association as humans. And that seems relatively simple, but hard to enforce, as we can see with the numerous wars going on at the present moment. So thank you for reading that. It is I think that Bellamy Foster's text is important as a touchstone, if only because it reminds us that there's kind of a through line in scientists who do Marxism or Marxists who do science, and that it's not a trivial matter. It is actually pretty important. It is not more important than anything else. It just simply is a uh, hitherto less attended to, and I think Bellamy Foster brings that forward, so that and his goal, of course, is to allow us to be Marxists and be ecologists at the same time, which is problematic for some folks, actually for a lot of folks, and it allows us to move forward a little better than we did before. But as I've tried to point out in prior sort of musings, there still is a very conservative a set of points of view. The fixity of labor theory of value, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I digress. Is that a sufficient response, Kelly?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes.
I mean, it is a kind of tolerance that we have, and yes, there are contemporary anarchists who are very proud of their anarchism, but I often think that they see it in certain historical contexts, which are important contexts. There's no doubt about that. Some people are fixed, for example, on the role of anarchists in the Spanish Civil War, which is really important because the proper military, strategic, and tactical action was either compromised or made problematic by this kind of division between anarchists and socialists, for example. And it's not something that I subscribe to, but I know that there's some people who do subscribe to the certain historical places where, anarchism is really important. It's probably the only thing that kept the left alive in some historical context. Okay, I've bludgeoned everyone into uh yes, Kelly, I do think that that's it is an issue. It one always needs to be self-critical about it. That's all. As I discovered with the class unity folks that once I started looking into who is what, and there is a kind of uh a certain division of labor or conceptual labor anyway in among the group there, and I will try. I acknowledge it and will try in the future not to be quite so to take it so personally. Let's put it that way. Um, okay, if there are no other bludgeonings of whatever, I will end the